All right, looks like we're live. Welcome everyone to episode 5 of the Accessible Web Podcast. Today we're lucky to have Blaise Liffick from Pennsylvania. I'm not sure where to even start with saying who you work for or where you're at, but I guess we'll highlight. Sounds like you've been recently named the Professor Emeritus of Computer Science at Millersville University of Pennsylvania, and sounds like I'll let George do the bio, but you've been around the block, so thanks for joining us today.
Around one or two times.
Yeah, I'm really happy. When we first discussed the series, Blaise was definitely on the top of my list. We've known each other for quite a while, back during the days when I worked at the Institute. I'm really happy that we're able to carve out some time and he's joining us. Blaise, with a BS in computer science from Purdue University, entered the computing field during the age of dinosaurs, when computers were room-sized monsters costing millions of dollars, working for IBM and Eastman Kodak. When the age of desktop computers finally arrived, he became senior editor of BYTE Magazine, the small systems journal before finally pursuing his Masters and Ph.D. in computer science from the University of Pittsburgh, and yes, Temple University, respectively. His switch to academia resulted in some 4 decades as professor at Millersville University of Pennsylvania, finally retiring in 2020 as chair of computer science. He was recently named Professor Emeritus of Computer Science at Millersville. Over those 40 years, he has been awarded numerous grants and published dozens of papers, books, and presentations in his primary areas of research, the ethics of computing and human-computer interaction, with a special interest in assistive technologies. And I will verify he has written quite a bit. I've had the privilege of reading his CV. It's extensive. And I got to know Blaise at the Institute. There was a summer empowerment program for parents and users of assistive technology. And Blaise was the technical coordinator of that program. And the program allowed students, users of assistive technology, to come campus with their parents or caretaker and live on campus for, I think, a week or two. And the whole idea was to set up, work with them, and show them how to effectively use their assistive technology device. It was a watershed moment for me. I had no idea how extensive the use of assistive technology and what it allowed people to do. So welcome, Blaise.
Thanks, George.
Go ahead.
I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, good. Could you do me a favor, just thinking back during that program, why? Because I thought about this a couple months ago, like, why aren't there other programs like that? Because I find that there are AT programs in all the states, and they do a really good job, but sometimes outreach doesn't reach everybody. What was impressive about the program at Temple was it really allowed people to get low instructor to student ratio and really to understand. And some of the people that attended went on to college, et cetera, because they developed the expertise of AT. Do you think that we should have similar capacities in that model of working with assistive technology and trying to support that?
Well, I think the immersive nature of that workshop was really an important factor in its success. The fact that they came and lived on campus, and I don't remember if it was 1 or 2 weeks either. It seemed like we were there the whole summer. But the being on campus, number one, but also being interacting with the instructors the whole time they're there is a really good model. anytime you've got an immersive environment like that, you're just going to learn more than if you're trying to do it, 1 or 2 hours a day for, let's say, 6 months even. It just doesn't quite hammer everything home the way an immersive experience like that does. So yeah, I think that's a really good model.
Now, with assistive technology and the prevalence of accessibility compliance, which Peter and I are heavily working with Accessible Web, do you feel that with WCAG guidelines being folded into ADA most likely within the next 2 years, how important do you think accessibility law and assistive technology will support each other, or more so, will accessibility having a little bit more punch with the backing of the ADA? How do you think that'll affect with accessibility and people that work with assistive technology to get what they want or get what they need for employment or school or just their daily lives?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd like to think everybody would just do the right thing all the time, and they don't. They do what's expedient. So, wrapping it into the ADA law, I think, is going to move things forward in a way that we haven't seen before. It's, as you say, the extra bite to it to some extent. It's just, the fact that now you really have to do it that is going to matter. And we saw that with the introduction of the ADA in the first place. There were curb cuts before, there were ramps before, things of that nature to assist people in wheelchairs, for instance. But nothing changed wholesale on a large scale until the ADA was passed. And, that happened in 1990. And within a very short period of time, you had just massive changes in architectural requirements. And that has, made a world of difference. Now, it hasn't solved all the problems, even still today. Walking around my own campus, I was constantly complaining to facilities about sidewalks or curb cuts that had been damaged in some way, made it difficult for somebody with a wheelchair to get actual passage along a certain path. And it was a constant battle to remind everybody, this has got to get fixed. We're switching a facility from this building to that building. Well, that building doesn't have quite all the features that the previous one had. Upgrade some, and things of that nature. And, we started utilizing a lot of the houses that were contiguous with the buildings. And, students with disabilities can't access those houses because they aren't adapted. So, it's still a constant battle, but it's clearly better when there's some teeth to this, to having it as part of the legal code itself.
Looking back, when is the first time that you remember hearing, or when, has accessibility always been something on your mind? And I assume that it certainly became a more prevalent issue as we moved from room-sized, card punching computers to personal computers. But like back at BYTE Magazine, did accessibility come up? Was this something on people's radar?
It didn't, and I'm kind of surprised it didn't that early. It was about that time, though, that I was getting interested in a field that became known as human-computer interaction. Mm-hmm. And my sort of ultimate introduction to that was when ATMs were first installed. And we're talking late 70s. And I stood behind a guy who was trying to enter the amount on his paycheck that he was trying to deposit, and he couldn't figure out how to make it work. All the buttons seemed to be there, all the number buttons, but what was missing was a period button. So you couldn't. How do you put in cents on for a dollar amount if there's no period button? Well, they rigged up the display so that every time you punched a button, it shifted the number. And eventually, if you keep punching the numbers in, it'll shift over to the right place. Well, he couldn't see that. He couldn't understand that at first because there was nothing in his experience up to that point in time where he had been exposed to any kind of a shift system like that. And I stood and watched him for a while, longer than I probably should have, before I offered assistance, because I knew what was going on, because it was a computer trick. Shifts in computing was a real common thing that we did, but for everyday people, they wouldn't have noticed that. I did eventually, tell them, look, all you have to do is punch the number in. Don't even look at the display until you're done, and it'll be right. And he finally did it. And of course, once I show it to him, from then on, he doesn't have to be shown ever again. Mm-hmm. But that was, a really concrete example of what I came to learn about in graduate school with my major advisor, Tom Dwyer, that he called the solo learning method. And it had to do with, he was a pilot, and he was a pilot instructor. And the idea behind piloting, learning to pilot, is that you have to learn to fly the plane sitting next to an expert. The job of the expert isn't to fly the plane, it's to help you understand the mental model you need to build to fly the plane. And so the whole task is to transfer your expert mental model in such a way that those novices can understand and build their own mental model. And that became a sort of a touchstone exemplar for me in terms of everything I had ended up doing in my career. And I think it is a good way of trying to be careful with the way we design things so that we're not designing for ourselves. Because that's what programmers do. They write code for themselves. And it takes a lot of work to train them to think about writing code for the next person that has to use the system. And that, I think, has stood me in good stead in terms of a philosophy that I have taught all of my students.
Did accessibility ever come up? I mean, do you ever recall it being in the pages of BYTE Magazine? Were there early Braille keyboards or, like screen readers in early computers? Or is this something that came much later? And I mean, I guess I don't always, but, learned early on in this web accessibility journey and my own education about the advent of digital text and how revolutionary it was to have a newspaper be digitized and delivered via the web, because now a computer could read that digitized version, whereas before it was, if you were a person that's blind, you had to get the Braille version of the newspaper that was thick and expensive, or you had to hop on the NFB news line and spend your time listening to news you weren't necessarily interested in, but that was the only version. And then all of a sudden digitized text came over along with the internet, and now we could make these computers that could read this text aloud at your own pace, based on what you were interested in. So I mean,
I know it eventually did. My years there, it was a little early in the development of the technologies, right, that we were still trying to figure out how to draw with a machine,
Right.
you know, how to do any kind of all the diagrams that we published during my years at BYTE were hand drawn. You know, even the text was hand set as late as 1980. The technology hadn't advanced quite that far yet. I remember when the first voice synthesizers came out in the early 80s. One of the first things I did when I got a hold of one was used it to dial up our local pizza shop to order a pizza. And it was an interesting experiment in trying to get somebody on the other end of the phone to take it seriously. I mean, we were seriously trying to order a pizza. It wasn't, we weren't going to,
Not show up.
not buy one. We were actually pizza, but I did want to see whether or not somebody on the other end of a phone could understand the voice well enough, because it was, obviously artificial. The inflections weren't there. It was hard to anticipate what questions they might ask, and so have an answer that we could easily, type in and have, said by the synthesizer. And it took a couple of attempts before we could get them to actually pay attention to what we were doing with it. So again, it was just about the time I left BYTE when those things were happening.
So I guess it's safe to say that through the history of computers, the same way maybe it's happening with the web right now, that web accessibility is lagging way behind where it should be. And maybe it's never been a forefront. It's always been kind of an afterthought that let's get these technologies in place and then, make it work for everybody, and then we backfill for the people with disabilities.
Well, and that's the unfortunate part, is that it is always an add-on.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked for a lot of years to try and convince my colleagues to put it into their courses, particularly graphics courses and human-computer interaction courses, as part of the standard of you're not done developing until you accommodate everybody you can accommodate. And build it in from the beginning, not try and tack it on at the end. Because anytime you do a bolt-on of that sort, it's inferior to what you could have done if you developed a system to include that from the beginning.
Now, with that said, with all the progress we've made in technology and AI, why do you think accessibility is not baked in to the development process? Because if you use the argument, we don't have enough time, we're not going to get our return on investment for accessibility. But when you bake it in the process, you really don't lose any time. When you lose time and money is when you have to go back and re-engineer it. Yeah. With society's efforts of trying to bring disabilities mainstream, whether it's advertising or, people are, especially with the latest push for diversity to include people with disabilities, it's almost like window washing when they're not really putting the effort. All this money to spend on advertising, why isn't the funds put in making on a universal design aspect? Why isn't society just making this stuff accessible? Why do we have to respond to people that get a letter of or notification from Department of Justice, etc.? What do you think?
Well, not to how do I want to put it? It's not that accessibility itself is de-emphasized, shall we say. it's a, and I've been fighting this again for almost 40 years in my field. It's that the whole area of human-computer interaction, the way we interact, is always the last part to get developed. And it really ought to be the first. And convincing them to flip that around and view interactions as the key to the system is like pulling teeth sometimes. They want to get in and solve the technical problem, write the code that solves the equation. Okay, that's what they tend to focus on, and not how are we going to deliver this to somebody. One of the phrases that I've adopted as, again, one of my philosophies is the interface is the application. That it's how we interact with the system that matters. I really don't care what goes on behind the scenes. I don't care how easy or hard a calculation is behind the scenes. What I care about as the user is how easy or hard it is for me to access that information, to make use of the tools that they're purportedly making available to me. But if they're not accessible, they're not making them available to me. So, that's the part that's hard to get across. And it really is a mindset for developers that you have to teach them. You're not developing for yourself. You've got to think about the people you're developing for and create a mental model in your head of those people. That here's how I'm writing the code for them, not for me. Time pressures are certainly part of the mythos of the computing field. It is a classic problem in our field that impossible deadlines are set. And we're expected to meet those deadlines come hell or high water. And if we don't, the company ends up losing money. Why? Because they're trying to satisfy shareholders. So there's this constant push to get things out the door, because if they're not out the door, they're not making money. If we miss deadlines, the investors are going to complain. So anything that they can do to try and shorten the development cycle, they're going to try and do. Well, that generally means they're not going to spend the time it takes to develop a good interface, which also means they're not going to do universal design. Tough nut to crack.
Yeah, definitely.
Investors be damned. It's all about the customer, is what I'm hearing.
Well,
the user.
That's what, to me, that's the right is. Yeah, I don't care if I miss a deadline by a month or 6 months, if what I end up giving the user is a better system for them. Now, ultimately, of course, you got to get the product out the door and make money, or you're not going to have customers anyway. But there has to be a balance between those competing needs. And unfortunately, the balance right now is all toward rapid development as opposed to careful development, universal development. Now, that's not to say there aren't, there are a lot more professionals like me now than there were even just 10 years ago. 20 years ago, there was a handful of us. Now, there's a special interest group for the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, called Assets, and those folks are dedicated to making this stuff work. They are adopting curricula that emphasize universal development. universal access. And so it is getting more into the mainstream, but major corporations, I won't say they don't pay attention to that sort of thing very much. It seems to me more a ground up pressure of people who end up in industry who already know about universal design and are comfortable implementing it is what's needed. It much more grassroots, I guess, than trying to impose it from top down. But you sort of have to do it from both ends and hope to meet in the middle.
Yep.
And any legislation that enforces it is certainly from top down.
I just found this conference. I was not aware of assets, but apparently they have an annual conference and everything.
Absolutely, they do.
Cool.
A bunch of people. I've enjoyed working with them over the years, and they've been great in the last 10 years.
Nice. Yeah, we just did a round of hiring and across a few different positions, and hired a couple engineers that are coming on board in the next couple of weeks, and hired a UI UX designer. And I guess I was surprised by how many of these recent graduates that we ended up interviewing are studying human computer interaction. It seems like it caught me as like a new buzzword, like this new thing I'd never really heard being said that much.
One of the reasons that's happening is there are two pressures within our field that drive that. One is a curriculum developed by the ACM and the IEEE that includes exposure to HCI as a foundational knowledge base, and the accreditation aspect from the Computing Accreditation Commission of ABET, which is the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, which also incorporates HCI as a key knowledge unit that should be within their curriculum. And so any ABET accredited computer science program probably does that. I say probably because how it is. It gets done a little bit here and there, but it will be done more and more. And there's no question that the HCI field has grown in stature and respect over the last 20 years. 25 years ago, when I was working on my doctorate at Temple, I couldn't get anybody in the computer science department to take me seriously when I said I wanted to do a dissertation related to assistive technology. They thought I was nuts and didn't want anything to do with it. It's not hardcore computer science. And today you can find computer science programs where you can do that now.
Yeah.
So it has changed a lot in the last 25 years.
Well, and I think with groups like RESNA that are pushing that and have it included, do you think there's any chance of adopting accessibility as a requirement for UX or web development programs?
It certainly ought to be. I can't imagine a UX program that doesn't incorporate accessibility as a key feature. Not to say they're not there. It unfortunately all depends on who the faculty are or teaching the program. If they've had exposure, they're going to include it. If they've come up through a traditional computer science program, they probably haven't seen it. In most schools, HCI is still an elective. I know at my own university it is. If I wasn't teaching the class during a given semester when a particular student wanted or would benefit from that exposure to that, I could only offer the class once every 2 years. That means there are a lot of my students who are going to get through the program and not have seen it.
Yeah, and that's the feedback we've gotten from people that we've interviewed that have gone through comp sci programs, and they might have part of one class, but not a full class or course on accessibility. And to follow that up, how do you maintain it? Or there's no instruction on, maintenance or auditing, and how do you keep it part of the policy and everything else. Yeah. We've recently engaged with the DAISY Consortium, and I'm on one of the work groups for EPUB. Most of the group is for higher ed, at least the work group that we're supporting. And there's some representatives from Kurzweil and a bunch of the big vendors, and there's still problems of convincing, why the benefits of, let's say, accessible EPUB or accessibility. What has been your biggest challenge managing other professors on a college level just about accessibility in general? Because, we interviewed Carl Horvath, who was the head of technology at Temple for a very long time. What is like fighting? I use the term of fighting the windmills when talking about accessibility. What has been your challenge, or how have you been able to convince professors of why content needs to be accessible, especially when they say, well, I have no students with disabilities, and especially with the basic policy within higher ed or education in general, an instructor can't really do anything unless it's self-identified. And you might notice that someone might have a disability, but you're almost restricted to approach them. How do you win that discussion that, well, I don't have anybody that has a disability?
Oh boy, that is a hard one to crack. I don't know that the tools are there yet to make almost painless. And that's unfortunately what it's got to be, because I know my faculty, while I was chair, I know how damn hard they work, and how hard they work to keep their courses up to date, to do the research that they're demanded to do, and do the committee work that they're required to do,
and publishing and
everything that they're required to do. And then you say on top of that, well, you got to make all your stuff accessible too. And but you're going to have to learn how to do it on your own. We don't have anybody who can train you. We don't have any here who's how to do it. But you're going to have to do it anyway. And that's a no-win scenario for any, because they don't have the time. It's not in their strength areas, and the amount of time it takes them to do it is out of proportion with the other things they've got to do. There has to be a commitment on the part of the university in particular to make it a priority. And again, this is sort of where, the top-down versus bottom-up stuff comes from. From the top down, the university has to say it will be done, but they also have to say, and here are the people we have on campus who will help you do it. Here are the tools. We'll buy the tools. Here, we'll send you off to a 1-week class to learn how to do this effectively. Yeah, I know you can learn it on your own over, n number of months. And, we computer scientists are used to picking up a manual and learning how to do something. But there are limits to that. And most of the computer science faculty have reached their limits to some extent. But there needs to be more concerted efforts to make these things available in painless ways that faculty can, it's turnkey. It becomes turnkey. And they just can do it without thinking about it.
This gets into one of our previous, I forget which one of our guests talked about it, but maybe Dan Goldstein, but the idea that the real tipping point with web accessibility is in the hands of the authoring tools. When Adobe doesn't let you make a PDF that's not accessible anymore, when when they do everything they can to keep you from hitting save, or the software has the features to require an alt tag when you upload an image into your document, or you can't put the headings out of order just because you want to, that's kind of when it's really going to become easy and painless, because it's just using the tool. But as long as this is a thing that people need to know, I guess, as long as it's a bolt-on, to use your previous example, and it's not a ground up type of thing, it's going to be hard to get people to universally adopt this extra requirement, because it's always going to be seen as just that, an extra requirement, when really all these different publishing tools, whether it's Adobe making a PDF, Google making a Word document with Google Docs, or WordPress allowing you to make a blog post, once we can bake this into authoring tools, and people don't have to be trained about it, they don't have to be really consciously thinking about it every step of the way, that's going to be the moment when it really starts to catch on and be done universally.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Peter. The part of it is it's massive. That it permeates the industry itself and academia. I mean, it isn't just industry; it's academia as well. And I've seen this in academia and in computer science already in other ways. One of the other areas that's been an interest of mine and I've worked in for decades is the issue of computing ethics, the ethical use of technology, ethical development of technology. And, for years and years and years, it was tilting at windmills. It was, convincing my colleagues that ethics has a place in the computer science curriculum. That just because it doesn't have algorithms to it doesn't mean it's not computer science, or that it's not important to computer scientists to understand. And it's only since accreditation has forced the hands of computer science programs that ethics has been taught in computer science programs. Same sort of thing is going to happen here. You got to get them into it somehow. And I don't know if, I do know that those, the folks in the Assets Special Interest Group at the ACM are doing everything they can think of to encourage their colleagues. But it's also going to take, I think, folks who are more on the engineering side to and more on the disabilities support side to go to their conferences and interact with them there.
Yeah.
Carry the message to them at their conferences, like the SIGCI conference, the Special Interest Group for Computer-Human Interaction, that the ACM has every year. The Assets Conference is important, but those are sort of the choir people, right? They're the ones who are already converted. You need to get the others sort of linked in, and build the grassroots in that fashion.
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, I never knew this was a thing until 2016. I just wasn't aware of it, and as soon as I was, it was immediately like a light bulb. And wow, this is something we really need to be doing when we're building websites. This is the same as a car manufacturer selling cars with seatbelts and safety features. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And
but they didn't start putting seatbelts in. Right. To do so. I mean,
right.
Become a thing that was common. Mm-hmm. Seatbelts were available, but not many cars had them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cars in my early years that didn't have seatbelts.
Yep.
Now, I was at a session at a conference a couple months ago, and the session was one of the people in the session was from Michigan State, and they did a thing called they had accessibility champions on campus. Mm-hmm. And what they were people that were in each department or college that was the champion of accessibility, to kind of promote that first tier of accessibility awareness, to find out what was needed between educational technologists to the faculty to staff, etc. And it went really, really well. And I've been thinking about it for a while of and especially my passion, my interest of strategic outreach, is that I think it's really powerful to take people that are already on your side and run with it by example. And not put much effort. Now, I've mentioned this before, not put too much effort in converting someone that's just doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Eventually, there'll be some kind of a peer pressure from the other departments that are doing it well. And the feedback that I got from the Michigan State project, it was interesting because they just got together and had a work group and supplied information, and there was a really solid network of getting questions answered about accessibility. And eventually the policy was changed and there was funding along the way. But when it started, it was pretty much by the seat of their pants with no funding, which, I have a reputation of starting stuff with no funding and getting results, which tend to anger a lot of people when I was in academia. But do you think something like that would work on a higher ed campus in addition to trying to have accessibility built into programs when we teach our future developers?
Well, I think that it's a good model. There's no question that having an advocate at the table anytime anything is being discussed is important. In academia, it unfortunately also a matter of how the faculty can leverage that knowledge base into something that they can get promoted by.
Yeah, good point.
I hate to say it that way, but the driving force behind what most faculty do is, can I get tenured, can I get promoted? And you got to break through that. And help them understand that that anything that you do that promotes accessibility will be respected within their discipline.
That's a good point.
And that's where I've fought battles for a very long time, both in terms of the accessibility stuff, but also in terms of the ethics stuff. I had colleagues for years not want to count a number of my publications because they had to do with ethics or accessibility. They weren't computer science. And it took a long time to get around them. Now, thankfully, within my department, those people are gone, finally. And to some extent, it's, old timers that were very set in their ways and didn't want to see how things were changing. But it is a matter of sometimes convincing people in academia that there is something to be gained for them as well as for everybody else. Because altruism is fine, but at the end of the day, that's not going to pay their bills.
And that's the challenge with selling accessibility to any organization is, it's helping them to understand the scope of universal design and how this is going to make everything better for everybody, and getting them out of this mindset that we're doing it for the one person they see in their head. They visualize the blind person with, the dog walking down the street, and they think we're just doing it for that 1 out of 1,000 people that they see. And, helping them to understand, look, this is a big issue. This is a big segment of the population, and there are real benefits.
But the unintended consequences, as they're sometimes called, far outweigh sometimes the intended consequences. It's the old curb cut argument. Curb cuts were put in place for people in wheelchairs. Well, guess how many people use those curb cuts who aren't in wheelchairs? Mm-hmm. Every time you got a wheeled cart of some sort that you got to get across the street. Every time you got a basket of some sort, that we use them all the time. And the number of people who find that useful is vastly more than the number of people in wheelchairs. So helping them understand that is hard. Again, it's that get out of your own mindset, out of that base of here's what's going to help me, or here's what I'm developing for myself. It's helping them understand, that's not how you design stuff. If you're designing just for yourself, that's the worst possible way to design.
I mean, I guess you're going to have people in the world that have a sense of empathy, that consciously try to be empathetic, and, it's not always easy, and it's something, I think you do have to train, you have to have them next to you in the pilot seat, getting them in that mindset. Certainly some people maybe never are going to develop that sense of empathy.
I can't tell you how many of my students, having gone through my HCI class, come back years later after working at a company and say, wow, it took me a while to really understand what you were telling me about getting out and developing things, not for myself, but thinking about how others are going to interact with this thing. And boy, were you right. And, that's the ultimate moment for a teacher, right? Is for a student to come back and say, you were right. But it happens a lot. But it does take a special student, a special person, to really understand that, and and it's not everybody that's going to get that message.
Yeah, and George, I mean, to your point, I like the idea of just, and certainly I think how we approach expanding our network, finding customers, finding employees. It's like, let's find the like-minded people that are going to agree and are going to want to get on this, and help them to think like this. And, to hell with the people that don't want to. If they don't want to, when I'm on the call and, you know, somebody's like, oh, I got this demand letter, no way in hell I'm paying a lawyer for this, or, you know, like this is BS, yada yada, this should be illegal. And, you know, we try to make them realize, hey, it's, you know, maybe the ADA demand letters are an unfortunate thing, but generally it's a good thing you're doing. And, you know, I'd say that probably 10% of my sales calls, it's very clear that it's not a good fit. It's maybe someone just trying to do it for the wrong reason. And, you know, I don't have the time or the energy to convince somebody. I'll certainly take the first pass at it, but if they want to be a contrarian on the topic, it's just kind of like, there's plenty of people that are open to this and are willing to help us push this forward. And, you know, at some point, if we can find enough of those people, we're going to just outnumber and overrun the people that don't have any interest in this, and they're just going to have to deal with it. And, you know,
it's a matter of finding your natural allies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, Blaise. Got to wrap this up, but it's been awesome talking to you today. This is really cool.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I think we should maybe get another one of these if you're willing on the schedule. And we've kind of talked about accessibility and you know, academia, but I'd love to. I don't think we've really talked much about assistive technology, and it sounds like that's a huge part of what you've done in your career. So if you're willing, I'd love to set up a second one of these and maybe dive more into your work on assistive technology and what that all looked like.
I'd love to.
Cool. I've got to do one bit of housekeeping, George, and then I'll got to give away a T-shirt. And then I'll have you, I guess, do an outro if you want. But looks like the winner this week on LinkedIn. You can follow us. Just look up Accessible Web on LinkedIn. We'd love to have you join anyone out there and follow us. We're trying to hit 500 subscribers so we can live stream this on LinkedIn as well as on Facebook and kind of expand our audience to the business people out there that we're really trying to get on board with web accessibility. But the winner today from LinkedIn is Eli G. So if you're listening, Eli, drop us a line. And if you're not, we will track you down and mail you a T-shirt. George, you have any closing thoughts? Or
Yeah, Blaise, I'm glad we were able to connect. It's been too long. And I hope we can work together moving forward and getting another podcast and maybe doing some other work together. But always great talking with you. Brings back really good memories, and stuff that I've learned from you back during the day has held me strong for my pursuit of what I'm doing now. And thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've had a wonderful time.
All right. Later, everyone. We'll talk soon.
All right.
Bye.